I thought I'd get started with a little bit of background information as we wait for some more folks to join us. So if you're here for the talk on annual planning and the art of road mapping, you're in the right place. To tell you a bit about myself, I'm Sachin Rekhi. I'm currently the founder and CEO of a startup called NoteJoy, which is a note-taking app for both individuals and teams. And prior to working on NoteJoy, I actually was head of product for LinkedIn Sales Navigator, which is actually a premium subscription for sales professionals that I got the chance to incubate and grow to 200 million in revenue. And now with the Microsoft acquisition is doing over $1 billion in revenue, which has been great to see. I also have created a couple of different courses with Reforge. The first one is the Mastering Product Management course, which is especially relevant today because all the material we're going to talk about today is actually covered in the Mastering Product Management course. And at the end, I'll mention the fact that we're actually about to start the next cohort of this course, starting next week, October 4th. So if anyone wants to join us, you can hear a little bit more about that at the end. I've also created another course called Finding Product Market Fit. And that is all about this idea of how do we actually take a new product from scratch and find product market fit for it, whether you're at an early stage startup or whether you're incubating a new product at a larger established company, just like I did while I was at LinkedIn working on LinkedIn Sales Navigator. So that's a bit about me, but let's dive into today's topic and why I think today's topic is especially relevant given the time of the year we're at. You know, a lot of us right now are about to embark on or may have already embarked on the annual planning process. You know, every company has some form of this to really start to put together what does our roadmap look like for the next year, or in some cases, even the next couple of years if you're doing multi-year planning. Now, when I think about this idea of annual planning, the interesting thing about it is that I like to think about it as this great opportunity to really get out of the weeds of day-to-day execution and really to dream a bit, to put together an aspirational roadmap for the upcoming year. And this is really what annual planning should feel like. You're getting away from the day-to-day where you're just working on quarterly roadmap plans and up-leveling your thinking to try to come up with a more compelling annual plan for the rest of the year. Now, the reality of this is so many product managers and really anyone in the annual planning process often falls short of this aspiration. And there's a variety of reasons for this. And so I wanted to talk about some of those. But as I've gone through the annual process many, many times, I've talked to a lot of product leaders about their feedback on how they feel annual planning tends to go. And there's really kind of three core things I often hear from product leaders in terms of how they feel annual planning often goes. So let me kind of walk through this because they're very common patterns here. The first thing I often hear from product leaders is most of the roadmaps I see from my teams are largely incremental. I wish they would put together bolder, more ambitious roadmaps. And what they're saying here is that, hey, look, I get the incremental stuff, but why can't we dream bigger? Why aren't we using that annual planning process to be more ambitious and to be bolder in our plans? So that's one common critique product leaders have of the roadmaps that they often review in the annual planning process. Now, another very common feedback is that I often find the roadmaps I review are missing a strategic view on what is really going to move the needle for the business. It's this idea that you're hoping your teams are really being strategic, thinking about the few things that matter for moving the needle on the business and focusing on those things. But product leaders are saying that's not what they're feeling like they're getting from the annual plans from their teams. And so that's another key challenge that folks are facing. Now, finally, the last one is when our teams present their prioritized list of initiatives, I rarely understand why they're prioritizing them. And this is this idea that I'm seeing a great roadmap, I'm seeing all the different product features and enhancements and improvements that they're planning, but the team is not giving me a great sense of why. Why are we prioritizing these things as opposed to any other thing? And really, there's this sort of lack of explanation behind where this roadmap is coming from. And product leaders are really hoping to see that. And so these are some of the challenges that product leaders are really kind of experiencing when they're thinking about this idea of annual planning and when they're reviewing annual plans. Now, I want to talk about one of the actual processes that has become fairly common in the annual planning process, which is this idea of rice-based prioritization. Now, this goes by many different names, and there's many different variants of this, but the whole idea is that, hey, maybe we can leverage a scoring algorithm to effectively score our various potential initiatives that we brainstormed, and then use some kind of score to help us rank them, and then thereby give us our upcoming roadmap. And so this is sort of a process that has actually become more common. But I actually think this is causing some of those issues that we just described. And so I wanted to level set on kind of what this process is to give you a sense of how some people are taking advantage of this. And so RICE, as I mentioned, is just one of these scoring frameworks that you can leverage. And in this case, it stands for reach, impact, confidence, and effort. And so the idea is that when you're brainstorming potential initiatives to prioritize for the next year, you basically look at each initiative and you score it on these 4 attributes. The first one is reach. How many people will this initiative reach, right? So obviously we should prioritize features and functionality that are going to impact a broader set of our users as opposed to a smaller set of our users. Now, the next factor you might look at is impact. So what's the impact that this feature will have, or this initiative will have? Is it going to have a small impact, or is it going to have a large impact? And you can come up with an appropriate score based on that. Then, of course, we want to think about confidence, right? We're coming up with this assessment of how many users it will reach and what impact it'll have, but we're going to have a varying degree of confidence on this. Some things might be low-hanging fruit, so it's clear it's going to add value, so we have high confidence, or some things might be riskier. And so we want to come up with an assessment of our confidence, which is really the opposite of risk, to help score that initiative. And finally, we want to look at effort in terms of what is actually the effort involved to go do this initiative. Normally, we think about this in person months or person weeks in terms of cost of it. And so what we can do once we have these 4 scores is come up with an aggregate score by basically taking reach, multiplying it by impact, multiplying that by confidence, and dividing it by effort. And this sort of gives you a sense of ROI for a given initiative. So let's take a quick look at what that might look like. So let's imagine we have 3 initiatives here. You can see the various reach, impact, confidence, and efforts. And then we come up with a score. And you can see initiative 1 has a RICE score of 25, initiative 2, 20, and initiative 3, 10. And the idea here is we would then rank this based on that RICE score, and we'd make a cutoff based on how many resources we have and what a level of effort we can actually accomplish in a given year, a given quarter, and then that becomes our roadmap. So this is sort of a common method. As I mentioned, some people use RICE. There's other various methods of this, but the whole idea here is to try to make the process a little bit more scientific by adding this rigor of scoring each of the initiatives, coming up with a score, and using that to rank initiatives based on an assessment of ROI. Now, here's why I think this is actually challenging and has some pretty material downsides that are contributing to those challenges that I mentioned product leaders are pretty frustrated with. Now, the first one is that this RICE prioritization model is divorced from strategy. It's not really taking advantage of your strategy. It's really looking at just ROI of any given initiative, but not telling us whether we're getting closer or further from our stated strategy. So that's one big problem. The second big problem is it really prioritizes incremental work. And so you can see this very specifically here. So for example, you look at initiative 1, the impact is very minimal, but the confidence is high and the effort is low. This is the very definition of low-hanging fruit. And that actually gets a very high score. Now you compare it to another initiative that actually has a much larger potential impact, But by the very nature of big, ambitious things, it's lower confidence and higher effort. But in this scoring model, it gets a lower score. And so you end up deprioritizing these potential needle moving initiatives in favor of incremental initiatives. And that's also challenging when our product leaders are asking us to be bolder and more ambitious. Now, the final challenge with rice is it gives a false sense of rigor. And it's this idea that, you know, those actual numbers that we're throwing into the model, our reach score, our impact score, you get a sense that they're arrived at rigorously, but let's be honest, most of them are fairly subjective. We're kind of sitting around in a room coming up with these numbers. And so now you're multiplying it into a formula which makes it feel rigorous, but it's actually very subjective. And so we're getting a false sense of rigor and a false sense of a simple process because of that subjectiveness that's being thrown into the model. Now, that's important because the new approach I'm going to advocate for is going to feel more like art than science. But I think we had a false sense of science using a method like rice in the past. And so this is one of the challenges of some of the frameworks that folks have been using to date. And so I want to start talking about a new approach, which I think will help solve for those specific challenges that we talked about product leaders being frustrated with. They want bigger, bolder, ambitious roadmaps. They want things to be less incremental. They want things to be more strategic. And so I want to talk about an approach that I think will help you in the annual planning process to come up with that kind of roadmap. And so the idea with the 4D road mapping process is we start by deciding what are the most important metrics to move in the upcoming year, right? So like we all have a business and our business is in various states and states of maturity. So we got to figure out what are the things that we need to improve right now and what are the top priorities from a metrics perspective. We then are going to brainstorm potential initiatives to improve those metrics, but we're actually going to use 4 different lenses that are going to enable us to be more divergent in our thinking about how we can actually improve those key metrics. So let's break that down. We'll start by helping to figure out what are the key metrics that we need to move in terms of making the biggest impact on our product and our customers. So the idea here is that we want to be very thoughtful about our business and breaking down our product into a set of outcome metrics that we care about. Now, oftentimes when we're thinking about outcome metrics, it's actually easy to divide up the actual metrics into 3 categories: acquisition, retention, and monetization metrics. So in the Mastering Product Management course that I talked about, we have a whole deep section on metrics and coming up with dashboards and figuring out what are the most important metrics to follow. But let's just talk about it at a very high level here. We want to figure out what those key metrics are and then determine what the input metrics are that ultimately have the biggest impact on moving those metrics. And what you're looking at here is a simple driver tree. Some outcome metric might break down into a set of input metrics, and then it might itself break down to further input metrics. And you want to do this across acquisition, retention, and monetization. And then isolate what are the KPIs? What are the most important input metric that's going to have the largest impact on your outcome metric, right? And so once you've done that, you can then start to ask yourself, well, where are we in the maturity of our business? And what is the burning fire set of issues? Maybe you're like, hey, look, we have a leaky bucket. Our retention on our product's not very good. So really, we want many of our initiatives for the next year to be focused on improving retention. Or you might decide, okay, actually, the product is retaining pretty well, but we really have a top of funnel and user awareness problem. So we really want to move the needle on acquisition. And so that might become a key target metric that you're going to prioritize for the upcoming year. And so you want to come up with a couple of these metrics. So let me make this real by kind of showing you what this might look like for LinkedIn Sales Navigator, the product I mentioned I worked on before. So the way we thought about it is we broke down our outcome metrics to acquisition, retention, and monetization. So we were a premium subscription. Most of our users came from the free LinkedIn user base. So free trial starts was a key metric that we are tracking from the acquisition side. How many people are trying a free trial of LinkedIn Sales Navigator? The more people tried it, ultimately turned into users. Now, on the retention side, we looked at things like weekly active users. How many people were using and staying using our product on a weekly basis? And finally, on a monetization side, we looked at recurring revenue. We were an annual-based subscription, so we were measuring ourselves in the ultimate outcome by our ARR and our annual recurring revenue. Now, we broke that down into a set of input metrics that you can see here. But let's say, for example, we ultimately decided, hey, look, and this happened at times with Sales Navigator, our most important outcome metric to move is retention. We really think retention is the thing that we need to be improving. It's not very high right now. We think that's where we want to make our focus for the next year. And then we might break it down and actually look at specific input metrics that we think will move it. One of the things we learned was that the more people search in Sales Navigator, the more retained they were in the product. So search queries had a strong correlation. So that became a KPI for us. So this gives you a sense of that first process, which is like, how do we figure out what are the key metrics that are most important to move for the upcoming year? Now that's good. Now we can start brainstorming potential initiatives to move them. And the way we're going to want to do that is by leveraging 4 different lenses for doing this. The strategy lens will help us think through what kind of initiatives can we come up with that will better align with our product strategy. The vision lens will help us think about what kind of initiatives will get us closer to our ultimate vision. The customer lens will help us to think through how do we solve for customer requests and customer needs that are top of mind to our customers today. And finally, the business lens will help us improve critical metrics. So the first question is, why do we need 4 lenses? So it turns out we're trying to solve for the challenges that we face, where sometimes we need to be focused on incremental work. We need to be making our product better every single day. And that's where the customer and business lens helps us do that, get short-term wins and improving the product today. But we also want to make sure we're having a needle-moving impact. And that's where the strategy and vision lenses come from. They tend to be bolder, more ambitious, more needle-moving. And by combining these lenses, it ensures that we don't overweight on one end or the other, which is a common challenge I see when people are putting together these roadmaps. And so this really helps us to think through all the different ways that we could potentially improve our product through these 4 lenses. So let's go through each of these lenses and how you might use it to brainstorm potential initiatives. All right, the first one is the strategy lens. So what aligns best with your product strategy? Now, this step is easy if you already have your product strategy well articulated. Now, of course, a lot of teams don't have a really well articulated product strategy. Now, in the course, Mastering Product Management, we have an entire module on how do you articulate what your product strategy is and how do you come up with that and the process for doing so. But let me kind of give you that at a high level because it's really useful here when we think about the road mapping process. When I think about a compelling product strategy, it really answers these 6 questions for your product. Who's your target audience? What's the narrow set of users that you want to use your product? What's the problem you're solving for those customers? What's ultimately the value that you're delivering for them? You then want to understand, why do we win against the competition? That's your strategic differentiation. And then ultimately, you want to understand how you're going to acquire users. That's your channel strategy, and ultimately monetize your users. And so in the program, we talk about how do you put together a product strategy map, which is sort of a simple slide or a 1 to 2 pager that answers these 6 questions that you can then coalesce on and align with your entire team on. Now, that is really useful to have in general, but incredibly useful when you're going into the road mapping process. So let's talk about how you then use it for road mapping. Now, in the road mapping process, now that you have your strategy defined, you can start asking yourself, where are the gaps between my stated strategy and where we are today? For example, on target audience, you can ask yourselves, are we serving our ideal target audience well? Are there things that our target audience is telling us that we're not serving them well on? Or you might say, hey, we are serving that target audience incredibly well. But the question really is, how do we then figure out the next adjacent audience that we might want to go after? And what kind of features and products can we go build for them? So this is how you're using that target audience to think through how to improve upon your product strategy. Now, when it comes to problem you're solving, value proposition, it's asking yourself, how can we better fulfill our value proposition? For things like strategic differentiation, you're like, how can we compete more effectively against our competitors? Or how can, for channel strategy, it's how can we accelerate acquiring users based on that strategy that we've defined? Now, this becomes super helpful to be thinking through what those gaps are and against that stated strategy and how you might fill them, and really focusing you on the needle moving things that are ultimately aligned with your strategy. So let me give you a really quick example of this from LinkedIn Sales Navigator. So we had a very defined strategy with LinkedIn Sales Navigator, and we had a clear set of value propositions that we were trying to deliver. Remember, Sales Navigator is a sales tool, and one of the value propositions we have is helping you to identify the right buyer. We want to help you figure out who to sell to that actually needs your products and services, right? So you're not wasting time talking to people in the company that don't need your products and services. And so normally we do that through a set of search features within Sales Navigator. But we started brainstorming, how might we deepen this value prop around helping you target the right buyer? And one of the initiatives that we brainstormed on this was, well, what if we could recommend potential leads for you to reach out to that we think are the right buyer based on using things like machine learning? And so maybe we'll just, when you're looking at a company, show you potential leads that we've identified through our recommendation algorithm that you could reach out to. And so we ended up building this. This ended up being ultimately successful in solving and deepening our value proposition, but really focused on that strategy lens of how do we deepen your value prop. All right, so we talked a little bit about how you use the strategy lens to come up with initiatives that align with your strategy. Let's now talk about the vision lens, which is this whole idea of like, how do we brainstorm initiatives that get us closer to our ultimate long-term vision? Now, again, this is easy if you have a well-articulated vision. Now, a lot of folks don't. And in the Mastering Product Management course, we have an entire module on how do you do this. But let me give you the high level here. I am a big fan of vision narratives, not vision statements. So a lot of companies have these single pithy sentences that are their vision statement. Now, that's great for your corporate website, but it's not very actionable when it comes to thinking about road mapping and actually making that vision a reality. Instead, I encourage teams for their specific product to come up with a 1 to 2 page vision narrative that really sort of details in prose how the world will be a better place in the future if your product is ultimately successful. Now, when you do this, you want to do a couple of things. You want it to be aspirational, right? Like the whole point of visions is so you can inspire the team. You want it to be detailed, where you're talking about real features and functionality that the future state of your product will have. You want it to be opinionated. You don't want it to be this generic thing. And finally, you want it to be user-centric. And this idea that it's focused on not the business and what the business is going to do, but how the world is going to be better for your end users. Now, let's say you've gone through the task of putting this together. Once you've done it, you can then, in the road mapping process, actually start to break that down into individual features and functionality that you ultimately might want to build. Excuse me. And so you can imagine your vision narrative is talking about certain components or features that you ultimately need. And you can start asking yourself, is now the time to take on a piece of our vision? Should we build this new set of capabilities to get us closer to that vision, right? And sometimes the answer is like, no, now's not the time. We need to be focused on our core product and our core platform. Other times it's like, yeah, maybe we can make a step in that direction now. To give you a great example of this, Figma is one of my favorite companies that did this incredibly well. So we all know Figma for its incredible collaborative design tool that helps designers to collaborate to build great designs and then to collaborate with their product managers and other stakeholders on those designs. Now, when you hear Figma talk about their ultimate vision, they're always talking about this idea of we want everyone inside the entire company to be involved in building better products. And what they realized is their core product is pretty good about engaging product managers, maybe some executives, and of course the designers, maybe a few engineers. But there's lots of stakeholders in the organization that aren't using Figma to date. Now, to ultimately realize their vision, they realized they had to expand their capabilities beyond sort of that core product design audience. And so they ultimately decided to invest and launch this new product called FigJam, which is an online whiteboarding tool that could be used by the product managers, the business folks on the team, the marketers, and get a lot of the rest of the team involved more deeply in that vision of having everyone collaborate and building great products. And so this is an example of them taking on this visionary element, being bold, being ambitious. Now, they still have a lot of stuff to do on their core product, and they're still doing that, but they decided it was the right time to start picking off elements of their vision from their vision narrative. All right, so that's how you'll use the vision lens to sort of come up with your initiatives. Now let's talk about the customer lens. This is the idea that you should be building things that your customers are asking for. Of course, we know this, but it's important to keep prioritizing that. Now, the goal here is this is easy if you have a feedback system of record. So we talk a lot about in the course, how do you create a feedback system of record that aggregates the feedback that you're getting from your customers and puts it in a central place? So then when you're doing things like road mapping, it's easy for you to look at all the requests that you might have, then to decide which ones make sense to implement. Now, okay, let's say you've gone through that process, you've created your feedback system of record, you can go to this database, see what the most requested features are. Of course, the goal is not simply to implement the most requested features. That would be a poor way of doing this. Instead, there's a couple of considerations you want to take into account. First, we talked about starting with what metrics are we trying to move, right? We're trying to move certain metrics, so then we can ask ourselves which of the features that have been upvoted most frequently help us improve the metric that we're trying to improve. We also want to make sure these requests are coming from our ideal target audience. Right? Maybe they're coming from power users and we feel like we've satisfied the needs of power users enough. And instead we want to be going after sort of a different adjacent audience. So you might not simply take the most requested features, but having this data set is incredibly impactful for making sure you're implementing the most the most important customer requests. Here's an example of how we do this with NoChoy, the product that I currently work on. We actually have a feature request portal that any of our users can upvote features on. Our customer support team also upvotes these features on behalf of users. So we have one source of truth on what are the most requested features. So we had an annual plan that was focused on driving user acquisition. And we actually realized one of the top requested features is public note sharing, being able to share notes publicly without having a login. And we realized that aligned really well with our goal of increasing user acquisition. And so we've decided for this year to actually prioritize it based on it both being a highly requested feature, but also solving for the metric goals that we have. So that's the idea here, that we want to be figuring out what our customers want, brainstorming what they want based on hopefully this feedback system of record that we have in place that's also going to move the needle on the metrics that we care about. All right, so let's talk about the business lens. The idea here is we're trying to figure out what improves our critical input metrics. Now, the idea is that we've already identified some KPIs that we care about, but we can then break that down further to even more detailed input metrics that we think will move the needle on those metrics very directly, right? And so when we're talking about this, there's a variety of classes of kinds of initiatives that we typically come up with when we're thinking through the business lens. Think of it sort of as your growth lens, right? Because this is where you're thinking about things like conversion optimization, where maybe we can make onboarding tweaks to get more of the users to the value in our product. Maybe we can make pricing changes to get more of those users that are visiting our homepage to ultimately convert to our paid products. Maybe there's ways we can drive up awareness of our various features and products. And so we're almost being mechanical about thinking through how can we literally move the needle on this metric most directly through a set of initiatives that directly impact those metrics. So here's a couple of great examples from Slack, right? Slack really wanted to, their focus metric for their annual plan was improving conversion rates, trying to get more people that were using free Slack to the paid product, right? Now, when they're using the business lens, they're coming up with initiatives like this. Well, maybe we can increase the number of promotion emails that we're sending to help tell our free users about the capabilities that are available if they buy the paid product. Maybe we can do things like adding an in-product upgrade banner that's telling users, hey, look, only 10,000 of your most recently messages are searchable. Know that you've lost access to a lot of your messages. And so these are growth style initiatives that are really this business lens that I'm talking about, where you're brainstorming initiatives to directly impact your core metrics. And this is, of course, useful. And this is also part of a an important roadmap that you want to have. All right. So we talked about now using the business lens as a way to brainstorm initiatives. So let's talk about where we're at so far. What we've done so far is we started with a set of metrics that we prioritize are the most important to move for the business this year. We've then used these 4 lenses to come up with different kinds of initiatives, features, improvements, optimizations, new products entirely that are going to help move those metrics. And so we, at this point, have 4 different lists of initiatives that are all designed to move us up and to the right across those metrics. Now comes the hard part, which is how do you actually coalesce this great brainstorming into a roadmap that we can then use for the coming year. Now, the goal of the output of this is we ideally want to come up with 1 to 4 high-level objectives that lump together initiatives from the 4 different lenses that are going to, again, move us closer to those target metrics. And I'm not going to lie, this part is the more art than science part of this entire piece, right? Like, sure, you could go and do a rice scoring algorithm if you wanted to on this, but I think it's really more about thinking through some of those factors, like which of these initiatives are going to have the most impact against our goal. Ideally, some of the initiatives you're picking off are showing up in multiple lenses, right? It turns out a top requested user feature might also align with your strategic goals. That's great. If you're picking off initiatives that show up on multiple brainstorm lists, even better. But you need to then put this together and balance across those lenses. Now, I want to be careful with the word balance here. I'm not suggesting let's get 25% of our roadmap from each lens. That's not what I mean. There's going to be times where you're like, hey, look, the NPS of our product is low. We have low retention. Maybe you're doing nothing for the vision lens that quarter or that year, right? Because you have bigger fish to fry. And there's one lens that's being sort of neglected temporarily because you have other priorities. And that's perfectly fine. That being said, starving all of these lenses is going to cause you to over-index in a way that likely is not going to be useful for your product, right? Like this is that balancing act that, great, let's be very strategic, but if you're not actually fixing issues that customers have, you're going to end up with problems, right? So a great example of this in my space, in the note-taking space, Evernote is a frequent example of this, where they had this great vision of all these new features and functionality that they wanted to launch, but they started ignoring basic customer requests, sync issues, sort of speed performance issues. And because they ignored effectively the customer lens, even though they were pushing on their visionary lens, they started to lose customers. And that's an example of over-indexing too much on one lens. And that's where this balancing act comes into play. Now, it's, I wish I had a simple formula I could give you to do this balancing act. But this is the art. This is the art. This is why we get paid the big bucks to be product managers, right? To put this together. But by going through this systematic process of figuring out the top metrics that you need to prioritize, coming up with ideas across the 4 lenses, I think you then have a solid foundation to then do that part of figuring out what ultimately will be the needle movers for your roadmap. All right, now what's interesting about this process is you get one additional benefit of doing your road mapping in this way, and I call it roadmap explainability. In machine learning, we talk a lot about explainability. Can we explain what the algorithm is doing and why it's, ranking certain things or prioritizing certain things. That same concept applies here, which is, can we explain why we're prioritizing each of the initiatives that we're prioritizing on a roadmap? And as mentioned, many product leaders feel like their teams do a very poor job of this. But one of the benefits of this road mapping process is it has it built in, right? For any initiative, you can say, hey, the reason we're prioritizing this initiative is because first, it improves target metric X. And you can be aligned with your leadership team on that's an important metric to move. And we picked it because we think it's going to improve that metric. Okay, great. That's the first step. And then you can say, depending on which lens you picked the initiative from, let's say you picked it from the strategy lens. Well, we're prioritizing this initiative because it fills a product gap that gets us closer to realizing our strategy. So you're very specifically picked it because it's strategic in nature. Or you can say, hey, it unlocks a key part of our long-term vision. And we think it's now is the time to go and do that. Or it addresses a popular and urgent customer request. Or finally, it directly moves the needle on a key input metric. And so in this way, there's no guessing for why you prioritize to give an initiative. It's 100% based directly on one of these lenses, right? And it gives you that explainability. And now that's really useful because, someone might be wondering, hey, look, this, why are you building this new feature here? And you can come back and say, hey, while we're doing a lot of great work on the core product, we want to be bolder, we want to be more ambitious, and we do think now is the time to unlock something from our vision. And that is far more palatable than sort of the leadership teams sort of feeling like, where's this feature coming from willy-nilly? And so this is an additional benefit of sort of using this process to really kind of come up with your roadmap. All right. So that was sort of this talk on annual planning and the art of road mapping. Now, today we talked about one of the things that PMs are responsible for, which is coming up with product roadmaps. But there's many other things that product managers are responsible for. So I want to make a little plug here for the Mastering Product Management course that I mentioned is actually starting next week that we'd love to have folks join us for. And the whole premise of the course is that instead of teaching skills, we focus on helping you be great at the deliverables that PMs are responsible for. And so here's the different deliverables that we go through. Things like product strategy, things like putting together a vision, things like getting to customer insights, really leveraging metrics to get insights from them, roadmaps, which we talked about today, things like OKRs, product specs, and decisions. And for each of these, we actually present a very detailed framework that you can leverage to bring rigor to your existing process for doing these things. Right, so today we talked about road mapping and we talked about one tool you can use to do that, the 4D road mapping process, which is the tool that we talk about in the course. We then do that for each of the other deliverables that PMs are responsible for. We kind of previewed that for product strategy, this product strategy map, which helps you articulate your product strategy across 6 dimensions. We also talked about a little bit about putting together a vision narrative. And so the goal of the program is to really up-level all PMs to help them to really feel like they have more of a rigorous process when it comes to each of the core deliverables that they're responsible for. Because too many of us as PMs sort of had to learn it sort of the hard way by either finding examples inside of our company, scraping it together ourselves. So we find giving people a solid foundation and frameworks for those core deliverables can be super helpful. So I hope you'll check this out. You can find this on the Reforge site. It's called Mastering Product Management. And as I mentioned, the cohort starts next week. I'll be joining for going through in detail some of the frameworks that we'll be talking about. And we have other great guest speakers that will actually be part of this program as well. All right. So I'm going to now open it up for Q&A. So probably the easiest way to do this is if you could just raise your hand, you'll then have an opportunity to ask your question directly. All right, we got a couple hands. Let's get going. How about Britton?
Yeah, thank you. My question is in regards to a couple slides back when you were talking about prioritizing objectives. I was curious, could you give an example? And specifically, I want to understand within those objectives, like what kind of breadth and depth we're talking about there. Like, is it 1 to 4 objectives across your entire product org, subsets? That's one question that I had.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple thoughts there. So part of this is you're coming up with a roadmap for whichever like usually there's a bunch of product teams in a given product, and each of those product teams typically will have their own roadmaps that layers into kind of a broader roadmap for the entire, say, product team, right? And then I'd say each of those product teams can have 1 to 4 objectives that are moving the needle on the metrics that are aligned with the company objectives, but specific to their features and product areas. Now, to give you an example, like one for NoChoy is we want to increase our user acquisition by increasing the flexibility of sharing within NoChoy. So what do I mean by that? Like NoChoy classic sharing in NoChoy happens by me inviting other people into a collaborative space, them creating an account, and then sharing notes. What we realized is that we want to grow our user base. That channel of virality had been incredibly useful for us, but we got a bunch of feedback where people are like, hey, I want lighter ways to share my notes. Can I email the contents of the notes to someone so they don't have to create an account? Can I, share a public link, again, so they don't have to create an account? And so lumped into this objective was a bunch of different features that were around the same theme of how do we increase virality through increasing flexibility of sharing, and then the different features that layer into that. So that might be an example of an objective. And again, it's sort of a theme that hopefully collects multiple initiatives or multiple features, as opposed to if your objective is just one initiative, it sort of shows a lack of focus. Ideally, you have multiple initiatives that are layering into the objective that you're going after. All right. Let's take Mariah.
Hey, yeah, thanks. My question kind of maybe piggybacks off that last one, but I guess I'm wondering if you could speak a little more about what level of fidelity you suggest having for an annual roadmap. So like you're mentioning objectives and initiatives, and obviously, as we kind of learn over time, like details around certain initiatives change, you get more detail about something or you learn something. And so that plan changes, but stakeholders are watching and maybe have expectations, especially once you kind of put something out there. It's like, this is something we're going to be focused on. So I guess I'm wondering when you're talking about kind of the annual roadmap and that like long-term vision, are you suggesting it takes a similar shape to like a quarterly where that level of detail is available, or is it a little vaguer? I guess I'm wondering about the differences between quarterly and kind of this annual roadmap you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I'd say is that like you obviously are going to have your annual plan at a little higher level of fidelity than you would at the quarterly plans. The quarterly plans should be more detailed in terms of very detailed initiatives because you're only talking about the next 3 months. So there's 2 key things here. You're going to have less detail in the annual plan in terms of the specific initiatives and the shape of those features. So for example, like for the quarterly plan, you might even start to have like a high level mock-up of what a feature might look like. But in the annual plan, that probably doesn't exist because you're still really at the ideation phase of that feature or that initiative. And that's fine. But you have sort of the high level sense of it. In the quarterly roadmap, you might be breaking it down to this quarter, we launched this half of the features and this half of the features next quarter related to that product. In the annual plan, you might not have that level of detail exactly where that's going to break out. And that's fine because the annual plan goal is to be more strategic and high level to figure out what are the big investment areas that we want to go after, and then leave the details to the quarterly plan. Now, the other additional element is you bring up a great point. These plans will change throughout the year, and that's okay. If it's not changing, it means you're not learning anything and you're building something in a very waterfall way. I like to look at the quarterly timetable as the best time to revisit your strategy. Have we learned anything new about what's working on our strategy? Revisit the metrics to be like, are things really not working and we need to reprioritize what we're going to prioritize for the next quarter? Now, the fact that things might change on a quarterly basis, I don't think negates this idea that you shouldn't be doing detailed annual plans in the first place. All right, let's take MG here.
I guess actually my question follows on from Mariah, which is around waterfall versus agile and an annual view. So theming them into those initiatives makes more sense. Perhaps there's more agile methodology inside those themes in terms of like the more feature level. But if you could just comment on, yeah, the balance between a preset plan versus working agile in a dual track product development type way or organization. And the other thing linked to that is whether this roadmap is sort of written in problem statements or opportunity sets so that it allows for problem definition to still happen, or whether it's written sort of in solution language already, which then kind of would feel more waterfall.
Yeah, great question. So I think both can work. It depends on the level of sort of maturity where you are in the product. Sometimes you have a very clear sense of what needs to be built, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have a specific problem that needs to be addressed, but the solutioning will happen within the quarter to go do that. And that's perfectly fine. That actually the objective could be simply to address a top customer complaint or top customer problem, and you'll come up with the solution later on. Now, having a sketch of that solution is always useful, so you can get some semblance of effort, so you can have some sense of it, but sometimes that's not possible, and sometimes you're going to just prioritize fixing that as a problem. So I think that's realistic. Now, I think having sort of this sort of more rigorous process in annual planning can work great with agile when you're thinking about agile for the delivery sense of how you're actually going to bring these feature functionality together. But I often find that teams that are too agile often miss some of this opportunity to be more long-term thinking and strategic. And so I like using both together in a model. All right, let's take Mayank.
Hi, Sachin. Firstly, thanks for this session. This was great. My question is, when you were talking about the challenges with the RISE framework, you mentioned something on the lines of divorced from strategy. I just wanted to get a deeper understanding of that from you because, you know, as I understand, business outcome and product strategy should be in sync with the business outcomes that, you know, as an organization you're trying to drive. So just wanted to understand that bit a little bit more.
Yeah, so the idea was that like some people, when they're using RISE, they're actually looking at the potential impact to the product. So like in that sense, they're caring about what the real impact will be, but the impact might be divorced from where you're trying to go from a strategy perspective, right? Like, for example, there might be a feature that's really impactful for a subset of users, and that might give you a short-term win, but strategically, you might have a desire to move away from that audience because they either monetize poorly or whatnot. So you might see the short-term metric win that shows up in that impact score, but it's not the strategic direction that you're necessarily headed in. Now, of course, if you do RISE and then the initiatives you come up with, you filter additionally by the strategic lens, that helps to alleviate this problem. But the RISE framework itself doesn't sort of give you that opportunity to be like, does this specific initiative align with where we're going from a strategic perspective, where we've decided, especially at the company level, right? Sometimes you have a strategic lens at the company level that you forget about when you're doing sort of feature solutioning and road mapping at a given feature level. And so the 40 road mapping helps to align that.
Thank you.
All right, let's take Love here.
Hey, hi Sachin. Thank you for this session. This has been incredibly useful. I am curious to understand as to how we can use this to leverage, how I could leverage this framework to clarify for my stakeholders as to why certain initiatives are being moved down the list. While I understand that the RISE framework might have its limitations, but it does give me a score. So For an initiative that is scored lower, it becomes an easy narrative for me to go back to my stakeholders and help them understand as to why I might be deprioritizing something. With the 4D road mapping, you spoke about narratives, which I can very easily use to create or craft compelling narratives for the initiatives that would be a part of my focus area. But how could I address similar questions or concerns about initiatives that would not be pursued in the upcoming quarter?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's sort of a two-prong approach. One is like, here's what we're prioritizing and specifically why with those narratives that we described. And that leaves less room for other initiatives. And oh, by the way, the specific initiatives that you're concerned about, we think they're either low impact, low confidence. You can still leverage the attributes coming from Rice to really talk about why that wasn't prioritized, even if you're not really calculating the specific score. And so I think using sort of those two approaches can be helpful to help craft that narrative of what you're deprioritizing. All right, let's take Mohammed.
Thanks a lot. A really quick question. So what if there's a lot of variability in the assumptions you've made in your annual plan? That's like 1 quarter in or quarter half in, you found like you're lacking on customer acquisition in one channel, for example, and you really reach to the bottom of your experiments, and now you want to do a micro pivot. Any idea around like maybe doing annual planning every 6 months instead, especially in the company that is in a different stage of its maturity?
Yeah, that's a great question. We talk a little bit about this in the Finding Product Market Fit course, which is really designed for products that haven't yet found product market fit, right? In that case, doing an annual plan can be difficult because you're still learning so much about what's working, who your target audience is, that quarterly planning is probably more appropriate, where at that quarterly level, that's where you're really figuring out, hey, well, here's the set of experience we're running. Here's the target audience we think we're going after. And so that might be more appropriate. And so part of what I think about is, do you consider a given product pre-product market fit or post-product market fit? And post-product market fit or some semblance of product market fit, I think having an annual plan is always useful. Pre-product market fit, it can be more challenging. All right, Radesh. Radesh.
Sorry, can you hear me? I was on mute.
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, thanks, Sachin. I'm a fan of yours. I have studied the course offline already. So that's wonderful. I'm enjoying joining your cohort as well. My question is, again, regarding the roadmap slide and the target KPI. I was wondering if we start from the target KPI and go down the 4D road mapping, won't it be catch-22 again? Because whoever is setting the target KPI might be coming up with, I don't know, some business KPIs that not like aligns or visionary enough to achieve the goals that companies or the product can achieve, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is sort of why we have the lenses, because I do think sometimes people start with metrics and then basically only do the business lens, right? They take those metrics, they break them down further, they come up with incremental initiatives or low-hanging fruit that's going to move the needle on those metrics. And again, those growth style initiatives are important, but if that's the entirety of your roadmap, it's not going to be very bold or ambitious. And so that's where I think finding those, using those other lenses, vision, strategy, and customer to brainstorm initiatives gets you away from sort of that incrementalism. Now, of course, it does, you do have to prioritize the right metrics. And that is part of the art of this, right? And part of it is actually aligning with leadership on that. Oftentimes where I see the disconnect is the leadership team believes this is the most important thing for the business right now in terms of metrics, and the product team isn't really aligned with that. They're thinking independently of those metrics, and that creates a lot of challenges with why you're prioritizing this versus that. And so I still think that high level prioritization metrics is useful. Now, it can be very high level, right? Like We want to improve retention. There's a million ways to improve retention. All 4 lenses help you improve retention, but that's still useful to say our real focus is retention compared to acquisition, or our focus is 50% retention, 25% acquisition. Like, that's a useful thing to align with leadership on, and then to come up with those initiatives.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
All right, I'll take Taran here.
Hey Sachin, thank you for this session. Very useful. My question is kind of leaning towards what you were touching just now. So, a lot of these elements on the 4D prioritization framework kind of sometimes come top down, especially vision and strategy, and some of them are kind of driven bottoms up, right, from the product teams. My question is specifically in the larger product teams, this becomes more complex. How do you drive alignment and influence for all these 4 different elements?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we talk a lot about this in the program, specifically when we talk about how do you come up with a product strategy and an appropriate vision narrative, right? And so part of this is at what level you're doing it in. The product strategy should really be at the product level, and then individual features should really layer into that product strategy. But like a vision can actually be done on a specific scope of features, right? So like for No Choi, we have an overall No Choi vision, but then we also have a vision for just the collaborative features. Like what is the dream state of collaboration inside of No Choi? We put together a little narrative on that. And so you actually have the power on your team to craft appropriate visions for your actual level of ownership in time that inside the organization, and then socialize that. The other thing you have the opportunity to do is oftentimes the product strategy isn't as articulated as you'd like. And you have the opportunity to help with that process where it's like, hey, look, I'm meeting with my leadership. I'd like to get to an articulated product strategy, but you can help fill in the gaps when they give you a high level sense of it, and then you're helping to fill in that gaps. That's useful for the alignment process. Also, simply documenting that product strategy is super useful. And then using that as a deliverable that you can then socialize not only amongst your team, but ultimately with leadership.
Okay, so basically, if in the nutshell, it's more about being aligned on the overall strategy, having your vision for the product area you're working on, and try to kind of drive the narrative around that.
That's right. That's right. And there's real work here, right? Like you ideally want to have a meeting with the organization before the road mapping process where you've articulated and reviewed the strategy or articulated and reviewed the vision. And I think sometimes this sort of just gets rolled up into the annual planning process, but it's useful to really consider that a concrete deliverable.
Yep. Thanks, Sachin. I'll definitely want to follow up on this more, but thank you.
Great. So we will have to take just the last question here. So I'll take Yulia's question.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for this session. It's very useful. I have a question. If you have a buyer user and your user persona are the different people, or even like by persona it can be I work with payment solutions and payment gateways, and work mainly as the white label, and we don't show ourselves to our merchants, but like we work with the partners, and then we articulate our strategy and the goals. Do you address them mainly to the merchants, or do you what can you advise to have the balance about this, or like what can you advise? Like I know that mainly we should concentrate on the final consumers, but like we work with partners and we should meet their expectations too. And also we have something like, partners, processors, acquirers, issuers, like we have like variety of buyer personas. So yeah, this is my question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And really, this is a strategic choice. I find you're describing a company that has both sort of a B2B and a B2C component. And what happens is I find different companies make different choices here. Some are much more B2B focused, where the company you're selling to is the ultimate buyer, and they're the ones you care most about. And so you're going to give them whatever they need, versus sometimes they're more B2C focused. Medium and Substack are a great example of this, right? Medium is very end user focused. Substack is very writer focused, which is sort of the B2B one you're selling to. Both strategies can work, The really useful thing is to make a choice and make that a company level choice. Which one are you ultimately solving for? And showing people this contrast between, say, a medium and Substack and what are the product trade-offs that come from that is actually super useful to help suss that out. So I can't give you that answer, but it's something that is a strategic question that you do want to answer within your organization, because all the downstream implications on your roadmap become a lot clearer when that decision has been articulated.
Yeah, and probably we also have to link this to our KPIs when we measure success. I don't know, like, what do I mean? Like, how many partners do we have? Like, in this case, we have one such. Yeah, thank you. It was very helpful. Thank you so much.
All right, guys, we do have to end the session now. So I apologize for any questions I didn't get to. You can certainly reach out to me if you're interested. And as I mentioned, check out the Mastering Product Management course if you'd like to. And I hope you found this valuable.
Thank you.